I find also the way they're reporting about the Indian-China border agreement,
Yeah.
which I think it's a great news for everybody,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
detention really is, they divert the attention. I mean, it's gone. So both sides, I think they're still working on the details, but they
Yeah.
do agree to withdraw. Both sides withdraw
Yeah.
the militaries. So which I thought is great news. But if you look at the New York Times, for example, this is what the New York Times said. Uh, any thaw between India and China could have global implications as the United States courts New Delhi to act as a counterweight to Beijing. So you see, for them, this is not about peace. This is
Yeah.
all about what you're talking about, chessboard, right?
Yeah.
This is always a
Yeah.
chess to play,
Yeah.
right? They can't just embrace and celebrate peace. They can't do that.
Exactly. Two great nations, the two biggest nations in the world, China, India,
Yeah.
two huge civilizations, countries with an immensely long history. I mean, well, we've talked in previous programs about Journey to the West
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
all of those contacts. Two countries which, by the way, in the 1950s worked very closely and in a very friendly way with each other. Zhou Enlai, Jawaharlal Nehru, very close friends. They worked together at the Bandung Conference in 1955, set up the non-aligned movement then. And all the New York Times can think
And
about is, it's not really so good for us because we can't play the one off against the other. And it's somehow, I mean, these people have completely lost all sense of reason and
mm-hmm.
sense, and I have to say morality as well.
Yeah. And they lie. I mean, the New York Times also lied in that article. They said at least they were talking about in 2020, there was a fight, right? So they said
Yeah.
during that fight, at least 20 India soldiers were killed. The Chinese government denied reports in Indian media that more than 40 Chinese soldiers had died. In 2021, the Chinese military official mouthpiece acknowledged 4 deaths, though doubts about the true count remain. That is a lie
Yeah.
because the Chinese government actually released those 4 soldiers' names and their pictures.
Yeah.
And the BBC even reported on that. So the New York Times should know. And yet they still, throw it out there, let people to wonder how
Well,
many
absolutely.
soldiers died.
Well, absolutely. I mean, lying has become well. I mean, well, let's not even start on this. I mean, it's become the default position of much of the media now. But absolutely, I mean, yeah. Also, again, harping on the border clashes rather than on the fact that there's been
Mm-hmm.
an agreement about to ease tensions on the border. It's a very important event,
Yeah.
and it's very, very good that it has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And let us hope that from this point on, the relations will continue to improve and we get back into a course where we start to see the relations get stronger. Because my sense was that um, when Modi became prime minister, leading a Hindutva government, things did begin to cool between
Mm-hmm.
India and
Mm-hmm.
China. And then never completely broke down, but Modi has always been more influenced by the sort of more hardline
Mm-hmm.
anti-China, pro-America factions, especially the business people in Mumbai and people like that. But I think a number of things have happened recently. There was the coup in Bangladesh, which I think horrified
Mm-hmm.
the Indian establishment. I think there's been this insane policy that Canada has followed of
Mm-hmm.
trying to quarrel with India over the Sikhs and all of this. And I think one way or the other, the Indian government is beginning to understand that you cannot have equal relations with the United States. The
Mm-hmm.
Americans will never accept that, and
Yeah.
that in India's own interests, economic, political, strategic, it needs to have a good working relationship with China.
Yeah, and it just always amazes me the way they using the English words, like what you just said, Russian organized a conference, right? Instead of
Mm.
talking about BRICS. And then New York Times saying, oh, the lingering doubts about the death toll. They
Yeah,
want to make it sound
yeah,
more brutal than it really
yeah,
is, right? So
absolutely.
yeah. but it's fascinating. I like since English is my second language, I'm still learning. It's always interesting for
Yeah.
me to read these way of describing things.
Yes. English is one of the most sophisticated languages in the world. It can be incredibly clear if used
Hmm.
properly, but unfortunately, if used badly, if used wrongly, it can be easily used in that way as well. By the way, you know that I studied Chinese for a short time,
Hmm.
relatively short time, about a year. And my clear impression is the Chinese does not work in that way. The
No.
Chinese is much more clear and straightforward and direct. So just to say,
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I mean, that is totally different topic. We can have another separate
another
conversation.
discussion about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can give you tons of examples of how the language are different, but okay.
Mm,
Also, the other thing is, you see, the New York Times, they like to talk about this dispute about, India and China. Now, there's a real border problem now in Myanmar. I don't see much report in the West. There's a crisis. I mean, Myanmar has been a complicated country. It's extremely
mm,
complicated, it seems like. Just to give you an example, so officially recognized ethnic groups within Myanmar, which is much smaller country than China, they have 135. Whereas China, much larger country, have 50 plus,
mm,
ethnic groups. And then, of course, it's also used to be British occupied,
mm,
colonized the country.
mm,
And that has its complication. And now the US also trying to coming in. I mean, they're already in there trying to start troubles, etc. So there is a civil war going on, and now they are refugees at the border. Now China made it
mm,
very clear you are not coming into China. So the border there is fences, there is a wall, whatever you call it, and then there's
mm,
soldiers there, armed
mm,
soldiers. I saw very little. For a while, isn't it like Myanmar was a great thing in the West? They talked so much about Aung San Suu
mm.
Kyi, she got the Nobel Peace Prize. Nobody's talking about this border crisis now. Why is
No,
that?
no, they don't. They don't want to do that because, well, first of all, um, they are worried about the overall political orientation of Myanmar, and they're trying to. I mean, I think there's no doubt about it. They're trying to achieve some kind of regime change in Myanmar itself. They don't want to talk about the border crisis. They don't want to acknowledge that there's issues between, that there are issues along the border which affect China. They want to make China look like a threatening force
Mm-hmm.
within the domestic politics of Myanmar so that they can then, in their own way, legitimize their own interference in the politics of the country, which they're trying to, pull away from China, basically. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
when I say pull away from China, that is that's not really correct because, of course, that implies that China is somehow Myanmar is connected to China. So the
Mm-hmm.
point is that they're neighbors, and
Yeah.
that's the what they want is a Myanmar that is pro-Western and axiomatically, therefore, anti-Chinese.
Yeah. And they never talk about when they talking about Myanmar, and now they don't. But even when they do talk about
Yeah.
the Rohingya genocide, for a while they were talking about that. I find it's remarkable they never tell you the history about the Rohingyas, right? It's also another legacy, the bad legacy left by the British, isn't it?
Yeah.
That the Rohingyas are coming from Bangladesh.
Yeah.
They took the British took them there to fight the
Yeah.
Myanmars, right? And that's where
Yeah.
this root of the hatred started. The Myanmar people versus the Rohingya.
Yeah.
The Myanmar people think Rohingya are the invaders, right? They are colonizers. So that's,
Mm.
but you don't read that at all in the
No,
Western media.
you never do. You never do. The British have this wonderful ability that they exist, and the Americans too, that everything only happens in the present. There's never any history or historical context about that. So if there's a crisis in Myanmar, it's entirely, and if, you only explain it by related to the events of today. You
Mm-hmm.
don't look back. You
Mm-hmm.
don't ask yourself what the British themselves had previously been doing there. By the way, and just to let your Chinese, your viewers know, one British official who was present in Myanmar in the 1920s was a man who subsequently became a writer, and that was George Orwell. And
Oh, okay.
he worked in the British Imperial Police in Myanmar,
Okay.
and he developed many of his political ideas and beliefs as a result of his experiences there. I'm just saying.
That's interesting. Now that makes sense if you think about what he wrote, right? He observed it
Exactly.
firsthand. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's a little known aspect of his
Uh-huh.
past, even though one that was extremely important to him
Important, yeah.
personally.
Mhm.
He
Oh.
even wrote a book about it,
Mhm.
which is never read.
Well, I'll look it up then. It sounds interesting. All right. I do want to talk to you about the nuclear thing. Before
Yeah,
that, North Korea sent 12,000 troops in Russia. Supposedly they get some training and then they're going to deploy to the Russia and Ukraine war. Now that is kind of expand the war because so far, even though
yeah,
NATO is heavily involved with
yeah,
their mercenaries and with their weapons but there is not official troops deployed
yeah,
there. But this is official foreign and then third country, right? Join.
yeah.
So what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, North Korea has denied it. They've said that they're not sending any troops to fight. And I think this is almost certainly true, by the way. What I think is happening is this. Well, first of all, can I just say that from a Russian point of view, and I'm talking now strictly a Russian point of view, this makes no military sense. I mean, North Koreans do not speak Russian. I
No.
mean, the Russians do not speak Korean. So, in what language are these two armies going to communicate with each other in? They have no experience, no recent experience of training together. They have little understanding of each other's doctrines or organization. They've re-established close military contacts only for a relatively short time. And given the sensitivity of any such step, surely both the North Koreans and especially the Russians, perhaps, would want to get China's view before doing something like this. And there is no hint of that. So, what I think is happening here is I think that probably there are North Korean troops who have gone to Russia. There's recently been a defense agreement reached between
Mhm.
Russia and North Korea. I think what the Russians are offering is training systems to the North Koreans, which has happened in the past. I think that there are exchanges and that kind of thing, part of the normal course of establishing military relations. I don't think they're heading to fight in the war in Ukraine. The Russians are winning in Ukraine. They don't need the North Koreans there. All
Yeah.
I can see is that that would simply create problems. This story has been taken up by the Ukrainians and by the South Koreans, each
Yeah.
for their
Yes.
own independent reasons, because
Mhm.
they each want to build up this story, because there are currently tensions, as we discussed in our previous program, between the two Koreas. And the Americans want to lean on the South Koreans to be harder on the Russians. And the Ukrainians want to tell everybody that other parties are joining the war in Ukraine. So let's have the West join up as well. But if you notice, the Americans themselves have been unusually quiet about this. Austin, I understand, is saying that he's asking the Russians, what are those North Korean troops doing in Russia? But he's not yet raising the alarm bells. So I don't myself think that there is real much substance to this story. And the North Koreans, on that specific issue, have denied it.
Yeah, that's what my surprise, I'm a little bit confused
Mm,
because Russia hasn't said much about this.
no.
It has been widely reported both in China and in the West, but Russia hasn't said much. North Korea, like you said, denied it. It's the South Korea who called the Russian
Yeah.
ambassador, right, that
Yes.
protested this or something. But you don't
Uh,
hear much Russia. Yeah.
No, I think the Russians were waiting for the North Koreans to deny it. I think that the Russians, and one can see the kind of diplomacy because these are North Korean troops. So they wanted the North Koreans to come out and say no first. And that is why they held back. But again, I think at a government to government level, It is inconceivable that something like this would be happening without the Chinese government asking the North Korean and Russian governments, please tell us what is going on.
Yeah.
And I think that the Russians will certainly have given assurances to China before the BRICS summit in Kazan. I mean, I cannot imagine that a country that has worked as carefully to set up the BRICS summit as Russia has done would have done something like this. And I certainly don't believe they would have kept China in the dark, just to say.